The security footage from St. Jude's Hospital on the night of November 14th was supposed to be sealed. It wasn't. It leaked. And what the world saw defied physics. You see a 7-foot behemoth of a man, weighing 300 pounds, tear a steel door off its hinges like it was cardboard. You see 3 security guards tossed aside like rag dolls. And then you see her, the tiny, trembling new nurse in the oversized scrubs. Everyone thought she was about to be crushed. But watch closely. In less than 2 seconds, the giant is on the floor, screaming for mercy, and the rookie is calmly adjusting her glasses. Who is she? And what is the secret she's been hiding from the entire hospital staff? The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's emergency department hummed with that particular headache-inducing frequency that only the night shift truly understood. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, the witching hour for medical professionals. This was the time when the bars closed, the bad decisions peaked, and the city of Chicago decided to vomit its chaos onto the linoleum floors of the ER. Susanna Reed stood at the central nurse's station, clutching a lukewarm cup of coffee as if it were a holy relic. She looked exhausted. At 5'3", with hair pulled back in a messy bun that was already surrendering to gravity. She didn't look like the kind of person who could handle a code blue, let alone a crisis. She looked like a librarian who had taken a wrong turn. Her scrubs were slightly too large, swallowing her frame, and she had a nervous habit of tapping her pen against her clipboard when Dr. Higgins was shouting orders. "Reed, I need that saline drip in Bay 3 yesterday." "Doctor!" Higgins barked, not looking up from a suture kit. He was a good doctor, but possessed the bedside manner of a chainsaw's. "On it, doctor," Susanna squeaked, her voice cracking slightly. She scrambled toward the supply closet, nearly tripping over her own clog. A few of the senior nurses exchanged glances. "She's not going to last the month," muttered Brenda. The charge nurse. Brenda had been at St. Jude's since the 90s. She had seen it all: gang shootings, multi-car pileups, overdoses. In her eyes, Susanna Reed was soft. "She flinches every time a drunk yells. She's too timid. Give her a break." "Bren," said Mike, one of the younger RNs, leaning back in his chair. "She's efficient. Her charts are perfect. Maybe she's just quiet." "Quiet gets you killed in here," Brenda retorted, highlighting a patient file with aggressive strokes. "You need grit. You need to be able to stare down a meth head with a jagged bottle and tell him to sit his ass down. Reed. She looks like she apologizes to the furniture when she bumps into it." It was true. Susanna was politely invisible. She had transferred to St. Jude's 3 weeks ago from a small private clinic in rural Ohio, or at least, that was what her resume said. She kept to herself, ate her lunch in her car, and never joined the others for drinks after shift. When asked about her family or her past, she gave vague, polite answers that deflected any real scrutiny to the staff of St. Jude's. She was just the rookie, a placeholder until someone tougher came along. The ER doors slid open with a hiss. 2 paramedics wheeled in a teenager with a broken ankle from a skateboarding accident. Routine. Boring. Even. The adrenaline in the room was low. The security guard, a heavy-set man named Paul, was dozing by the vending machines, a half-eaten bag of chips resting on his chest. Susanna finished setting the IV for the dehydration case in Bay 3 and stepped back out into the hallway. She wiped sweat from her forehead. She hated the deception, the act she had to put on. Being the timid mouse was exhausting. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to stand straighter, to walk with the predator's grace she had spent a decade perfecting. But she couldn't. Not here. Not after what happened in Seattle. She had promised herself, just be a nurse, just heal people. No more violence. She checked the clock. 2:45 a.m. Almost halfway there, she whispered to herself. But the universe, it seemed, had a different schedule. The radio at the triage desk crackled to life. It wasn't the usual paramedic chatter. It was a police band patch-through, breathless and distorted by static. Dispatch. We have a 1096 highly aggressive male. Suspect is massive. Repeat. Suspect is huge. On PCB. He's tore through the cuffs, heading towards St. Jude's. Medical distress. Watch out. The transmission cut out with a sharp squeal. Brenda looked up from her desk, frowning. Paul, wake up. Paul snorted awake, blinking rapidly. What's going on? Incoming, Brenda said, her voice tightening. Sounds like a bad one. Susanna felt a prickle on the back of her neck. It was a sensation she hadn't felt in years, a spidey sense that usually preceded broken bones and blood. She instinctively shifted her weight to the balls of her feet, then caught herself and slumped back into her tired nurse posture. Just a drunk, she told herself. Just another angry drunk. Then they heard it. It started as a low thrumming sound from the parking lot, like a heavy engine revving, followed by a crash that sounded like a dumpster being thrown into a wall. The automatic sliding doors to the ambulance bay didn't open. They exploded inward. Glass shattered across the waiting room floor, spraying like diamonds. A receptionist screamed and ducked under her desk. Standing in the ruined frame of the entrance was a nightmare made of flesh. He had to be 7 feet tall. He was shirtless. Despite the freezing Chicago November air, his skin glistening with sweat and rain. His chest was a road map of prison tattoos and scars, muscles coiled around his bones like steel cables. His eyes were wide, white-rimmed, and completely vacant of humanity. He was high on something synthetic, something that turned off the pain receptors and turned up the aggression dial to 11. This was Jerome the Titan Banks, a former underground cage fighter who had been banned for nearly killing an opponent, now reduced to a street enforcer for the local cartels. And right now, he was having a psychotic break. "Help me!" Jerome roared. The sound was deafening, a bass note that rattled the ribs of everyone in the room. But it wasn't a plea. It was a demand. "Get it out! Get the bugs out!" He clawed at his own chest, drawing blood. "Code Grey security to the ER now." Brenda yelled into the overhead page, her voice trembling for the first time in years. Paul, the security guard, stepped forward. He was a brave man, but he was 50 years old and overweight. He pulled his taser. "Sir, get down on the ground." Jerome looked at Paul. He didn't see a guard. He saw an obstacle. With a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a man of his size, Jerome charged. The violence was immediate and sickening. Paul fired the taser. The prongs hit Jerome squarely in the chest. The electric current that should have dropped a normal man instantly just seemed to annoy the giant. Jerome ripped the wires out of his skin with a grunt, not even slowing down. He collided with Paul. It looked like a freight train hitting a deer. Paul was lifted off his feet and thrown 10 feet backward, crashing into the triage desk with a sickening crunch of breaking wood and bone. He didn't get up. Chaos erupted. Patients in the waiting room scrambled, dragging IV poles and crutches, trying to get away from the monster in the center of the room. A mother clutched her child, freezing in terror near the vending machines. "Evacuate the waiting room." "Doctor," Higgins shouted, rushing out from the back. "Get everyone to the back." Jerome, confused and hallucinating, grabbed a row of metal waiting room chairs, bolted to the floor, and ripped them free with a single heave. He swung the hunk of metal like a club, smashing the glass partition of the reception desk. "Bugs!" he screamed, his voice tearing at his throat. "Cut them out!" 2 more security guards, younger and fitter, sprinted in from the main hospital corridor. They carried batons. They were confident. They didn't stand a chance. The first guard swung for Jerome's knee, a standard takedown tactic. Jerome didn't even flinch. He reached down, grabbed the guard by the tactical vest, and hurled him into the wall. The second guard hesitated, fear flashing in his eyes. That hesitation was his undoing. Jerome backhanded him a blow so powerful it spun the man around and sent him sliding across the polished floor, unconscious before he stopped moving. In less than 30 seconds, the hospital's security force had been dismantled. The ER staff was trapped. The only exit was behind Jerome, and he was currently blocking it, swinging his head wildly, looking for a target. His eyes locked onto Brenda. Brenda was tough, but she wasn't a fighter. She stood frozen by the nurse's station, a phone in her hand, dialing 911. "You!" Jerome growled, pointing a finger the size of a sausage at her. "You have the knife. Cut it out." He took a step toward the nurse's station. "Stay back." Mike, the male nurse, stepped in front of Brenda. Mike went to the gym 5 days a week. He bench-pressed 250. He looked the part of a hero. Jerome laughed a wet, gurgling sound. He swatted Mike aside as if he were a fly. Mike flew over the counter, crashing into the medication cart, sending vials of morphine and epinephrine shattering across the floor. Now, there was nothing between the 7-foot giant and the terrified staff. Nothing except Susanna Reed. Susanna had been standing near the trauma bay, clutching a clipboard. When the chaos started, she hadn't run. She hadn't screamed. She had gone very, very still. While the others were panicking, Susanna was observing. Target is approximately 6 feet 11 inches, 310 pounds. Her mind recited, the internal monologue shifting from nurse to something cold and tactical. Pupils dilated, PCP or bath salts. Pain compliance will not work. Taser ineffective. Upper body strength superior. Lower body unstable. He's favoring his left leg. Old injury. She watched him dismantle the guards. She analyzed the torque of his hips, the lag in his reaction time. He was a powerhouse, but he was sloppy. He was telegraphing every move. "Don't do it, Susanna," she told herself. "If you do this, the cover is blown. You'll have to run again." Jerome lunged for Brenda. He grabbed the senior nurse by the scrub top, lifting her off her feet. Brenda screamed, her legs kicking uselessly in the air. Jerome raised a fist, ready to deliver a blow that would undoubtedly kill her. "Cut it out!" Jerome shrieked at her face. "Doctor!" Higgins was shouting, throwing a stapler at the giant, which bounced harmlessly off his shoulder. Susanna looked at Brenda's terrified face. She looked at the giant's fist, pulling back. Screw the cover, Susanna thought. She dropped the clipboard. The sound of it hitting the floor was lost in the screaming. But to Susanna, it sounded like a starter pistol. She took a breath. Her posture changed. The slump in her shoulders vanished. Her spine straightened, her chin tucked. Her hands, previously trembling, opened loosely at her sides. She didn't run. She glided. "Hey!" Susanna's voice rang out. It wasn't the squeaky, nervous voice of the rookie anymore. It was a command, a bark of authority that cut through the noise. Jerome paused, confused. He turned his massive head, Brenda still dangling from one hand. He looked down at the tiny woman standing 5 feet away from him. "Put her down," Susanna said. Her voice was flat, devoid of fear. Jerome blinked. The absurdity of it seemed to short-circuit his rage for a microsecond. "Who are you?" "I'm the nurse who's going to break your arm if you don't drop her in the next 3 seconds," Susanna said calmly. The ER went silent. "Doctor." Higgins stared. Mike, groaning on the floor, stared. Jerome grinned, a horrific expression. He dropped Brenda not gently, but he dropped her. She scrambled away on hands and knees. "You." Jerome stepped toward Susanna, looming over her like a skyscraper. The shadow he cast completely swallowed her. "You think you can hurt me, little girl?" "I don't think," Susanna said, shifting her stance slightly, her right foot sliding back, her weight centering. "I know." Jerome roared and swung. It was a haymaker, a punch that would have taken her head clean off. Susanna didn't retreat. She stepped in. The air in the emergency room seemed to thicken, time slowing down to a molasses drip. Jerome's fist, a wrecking ball of bone and rage, descended in an arc meant to pulverize Susanna Reed into the floor tiles. To the onlookers, Doctor, Higgins, crouching behind a gurney, and Brenda. Trembling on the floor, it looked like suicide. Susanna was motionless. She looked small, fragile, and utterly outmatched. But Susanna wasn't seeing a monster. She was seeing geometry. She was calculating vectors. Velocity high, mass excessive, balance compromised forward lean, open target radial nerve. At the last possible fraction of a second, Susanna didn't block. You don't block a freight train. She exhaled sharply, a quick tst sound, and pivoted on her left heel. The giant's fist whooshed past her ear, the wind of it blowing a loose strand of hair across her face. Jerome had put everything into that punch, expecting resistance. He found none. His momentum carried him forward, his massive chest exposed. Susanna moved. It wasn't the frantic scrambling of a frightened nurse. It was the blur of a viper striking. She stepped into his personal space, her hip colliding with his thigh. Her right hand snapped out, not a fist, but a rigid, knife hand strike to the side of Jerome's neck. Thwack. It was a precise hit to the vagus nerve. Jerome's eyes rolled back slightly, his roar cutting off into a strangled wheeze. His brain rebooted for a split second before he could recover. Susanna dropped her center of gravity. She wrapped her arm around his extended punching arm, locking his wrist against her chest, and kicked the back of his left knee, the one she had identified as weak. Crack. The sound was sickeningly loud in the quiet ER. Jerome's leg buckled, with his arm trapped and his support gone. 300 pounds of muscle had nowhere to go but down. Susanna didn't just let him fall. She guided him. She rotated her hips, using his own weight as a fulcrum. It was a textbook takedown, executed with such fluid grace it looked like they were dancing. Jerome hit the floor face first. The impact shook the medication cabinets. "Ah!" he screamed into the linoleum. He tried to push up, to use his massive strength to buck her off. But Susanna was already on his back. She wasn't just sitting there. She had applied a figure-4 lock on his arm, torquing his shoulder to the very limit of its socket. "Stay down," she whispered, her lips inches from his ear. Her voice was ice cold. "If you move, I will dislocate your shoulder. If you move again, I will break your elbow. Do you understand?" Jerome struggled, his free hand clawing at the floor. He bucked his hips. Susanna didn't hesitate. She applied 1/2 ounce of pressure. There was a wet pop. Jerome shrieked, all the fight draining out of him instantly. The pain cut through the drugs. He went limp, tapping the floor with his free hand in submission. "Restraints!" Susanna barked. She didn't look up. Her eyes were fixed on Jerome's neck vein, monitoring his pulse. "I need 4-point leather restraints, 5 milligrams of haloperidol, and 2 of Ativan. Now." The command snapped the staff out of their trance. "Go move! Doctor!" Higgins yelled, scrambling up. Mike, the muscular nurse who had been tossed aside earlier, limped over with the restraint straps. His hands were shaking as he handed them to Susanna. He looked at her as if she were an alien species. Susanna worked with mechanical efficiency. Click, click, cinch. In under 10 seconds, the Titan was trussed up like a turkey, face down, immobilized. Susanna stood up. She smoothed the front of her scrubs. She adjusted her glasses, which had slid slightly down her nose. She looked around the room. Every pair of eyes was glued to her. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the hum of the vending machine and Jerome's whimpering. The adrenaline dump hit her then. The soldier mode receded, and the nurse mask slipped back into place, but it was too late. The shaking started, but this time it was fake. She forced her hands to tremble. She widened her eyes, trying to look shocked. Susanna stammered, backing away from the giant. My brothers. They used to wrestle. I just panicked." She looked at Brenda. Brenda was still on the floor, staring up at Susanna with a mixture of awe and terror. "You saved my life," Brenda whispered. "I have to go check on the charts." Susanna mumbled. She turned and walked quickly toward the employee break room, her head down. But as she walked away, she didn't see the teenager in the waiting room, the one with the broken ankle. He was holding his phone up. The red rest dot had been blinking the entire time. The break room was a sanctuary of stale coffee and humming refrigerators. Susanna locked the door and leaned against it, sliding down until she hit the floor. She buried her face in her hands. Stupid. She chastised herself. Stupid. 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 You exposed the skill set. You broke protocol. She checked her pulse. 140 beats per minute. Not from fear of the giant, but from fear of what came next. She had spent 3 years building Susanna Reed. Susanna Reed was from Ohio. Susanna Reed liked knitting and cat videos. Susanna Reed did not know how to execute a police-grade takedown on a chemically fueled juggernaut. She pulled a burner phone from a hidden pocket sewn into the waistband of her scrubs. She dialed a number that didn't exist in any public directory. "Status," a robotic voice answered. "Incident at St. Jude's," Susanna said, her voice low. "I had to engage a hostile. Level 4 threat. Witnesses present. Containment. Unknown. There were civilians. Stand by." The line went dead. Susanna closed her eyes. She should run. She had a go bag in the trunk of her rusty Toyota Corolla. Fake passport. Cash. A Glock 19. She could be in Canada by sunrise. But she thought of Brenda's face. She thought of the patients in the waiting room. If she left now, the hospital would be swarming with questions she couldn't answer. Running would confirm guilt. Staying was risky, but maybe she could bluff her way through it. A knock on the door made her jump. "Read." It was Dr. Higgins. "Police are here. They want a statement." Susanna took a deep breath. She splashed cold water on her face, put on her best, scared rookie expression, and opened the door. The ER was swarming with Chicago PD. 2 officers were hauling the groggy Jerome onto a gurney. A man in a trench coat, Detective Miller, was talking to Brenda. Miller looked up as Susanna approached. He was a weary man with eyes that had seen too many crime scenes. "This the hero?" Miller asked, looking Susanna up and down skeptically. "I'm not a hero," Susanna said softly, hugging her clipboard to her chest. "I just acted on instinct." "Instinct," Miller repeated. He gestured to the bruising on Jerome's neck. "Doc Higgins says you dropped a 300-pound man in 2 seconds. Says you knew exactly where to hit him." "Lucky shot," Susanna offered. Forcing a weak smile, Miller narrowed his eyes. "Miss Reed, I've been on the force for 20 years. I've seen lucky shots. A lucky shot is hitting a guy with a bedpan. What you did. That's training. I took a self-defense class at the YWCA," Susanna lied. "The instructor was very thorough." Miller didn't look convinced. He opened his mouth to press her, but his radio chirped. "Captain, you need to see this," a younger officer said, holding out a smartphone. "It's trending on Twitter, like everywhere." Miller took the phone. Susanna felt her stomach drop through the floor. On the small screen, a shaky video played. It was titled Nurse Hulk Smash. The video showed everything: the charge, the scream, and then Susanna, in high definition. The world watched her posture shift. They watched the cold calculation in her eyes. They watched the takedown. It didn't look like a nurse panicking. It looked like a special forces operative neutralizing a target. The video had 50,000 views. Then Susanna refreshed the mental counter. 100,000 views. 200,000. "Comments are going crazy," the young officer said. "People are saying she moves like John Wick." Miller looked from the phone to Susanna. The suspicion in his eyes hardened into something else: curiosity, and maybe a little fear. "Who are you, really?" Miller asked quietly. Susanna opened her mouth to answer, but the ER doors slid open again. This time, it wasn't a patient. 2 men in dark suits walked in. They didn't look like cops. They didn't look like doctors. They moved with a predatory smoothness that Susanna recognized instantly. They scanned the room, their eyes locking onto Susanna. "Ms. Reed," the taller suit said. He flashed a badge that Susanna couldn't read from a distance. "Federal agents, we're taking jurisdiction over this witness." Susanna's blood ran cold. They weren't feds. She knew their shoes. Expensive Italian leather. Government agents wore government-issued footwear or practical tactical gear. These men were private sector. Contractors. They found me. She realized. The video led them right to the door. 3 hours earlier, in a glass-walled office in Northern Virginia, a man named Victor Vance sat in the dark. The only light came from a wall of monitors displaying global news feeds, stock markets, and encrypted communication channels. Victor was a man who did not exist on paper. To the IRS, he was a retired logistics consultant. To the handful of people who knew the truth, he was the architect, the head of The Aviary, a black budget program designed to train deep cover operatives for medical assassinations. Doctors who could induce a heart attack that looked natural. Nurses who could slip a lethal dose of potassium into a drip without a trace. And his best bird had flown the coop 3 years ago. "Sir," an assistant said, voice trembling as he entered the office. The algorithm flagged a video. Victor didn't turn around. "I'm busy. Arthur?" "It's Nightingale, sir. It's a 99% biometric match." Victor spun his chair around. "Show me." The assistant cast the video from the Chicago ER onto the main screen. Victor watched the footage of Susanna Reid taking down the giant. He watched it once, twice, a third time in slow motion. He focused on the way she moved her feet, the way she checked the pulse immediately after the takedown, the specific torque of the arm bar. A slow smile spread across Victor's face. It wasn't a kind smile. "Look at that," Victor whispered. "She's rusty." She hesitated for 0.4 seconds before the strike. Domestic life has made her soft. "She's in Chicago," the assistant said. "St. Jude's Hospital, under the alias Susanna Reid." Victor stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. "She stole $6 million worth of encrypted data when she left. Arthur. She stole the identities of every operative in the program. She thought she could hide in plain sight, scrubbing bedpans and taking temperatures. What are the orders?" Victor picked up a phone. "Activate Team 4 in Chicago. I want her alive. She has the drive. But if she resists, well, accidents happen in hospitals every day." Back in the ER, the tension was a physical weight. The 2 federal agents were closing in on Susanna. Detective Miller stepped in between them. "Whoa, hold on," Miller said, putting a hand on his holster. "I'm conducting an investigation here. You can't just national security matter. Detective," the tall suit said, his voice bored. He shoved the fake badge into Miller's chest. "Step aside, or lose your pension." Miller hesitated. He looked at Susanna. He saw the terror in her eyes, not the fake terror she had shown earlier, but real, primal fear. "Susanna," Miller asked, "do you know these guys?" Susanna looked at the exit. Blocked. She looked at the break room. Dead end. She looked at the agents. She recognized the one on the left. His name was Kane. They had trained together in the Mojave. He was fast, sadistic, and he owed her a scar on his cheek. Susanna started, her voice shaking. "Ms. Reid is coming with us," Kane said, reaching for her arm. Susanna looked at Kane's hand. She looked at the pen in Dr. Higgins' pocket, 3 feet away. Scenario 1. Go with them. Torture. Death. Scenario 2. Fight. 2 targets. Armed. High collateral damage risk. Probability of escape 30%. Scenario 3. Create a diversion. Susanna's eyes locked onto the oxygen tank on the nearby cart. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Susanna said, dropping the shaky nurse act completely. Her voice became the steel command that had stopped the giant. Kane smirked. "There she is, the Nightingale." "Miller," Susanna shouted. "Duck!" Susanna kicked the cart. The heavy oxygen cylinder toppled. As it fell, Susanna stomped on the regulator valve with a precision that would have made a structural engineer weep. The valve sheared off. The compressed gas exploded outward. The cylinder became a missile, rocketing across the room and smashing into the legs of the 2 agents. Hiss, boom! The room filled with white fog and the deafening sound of escaping the gas. Kane went down, cursing. "Run!" Susanna yelled to the staff. But she didn't run for the exit. She ran for the trauma bay. She needed a weapon. And in a hospital, everything is a weapon if you know how to use it. The emergency room of St. Jude's didn't just descend into chaos, it vanished into a whiteout. The ruptured oxygen tank screamed like a jet engine, a deafening, continuous shriek that drowned out the panic of the staff. The compressed gas didn't just cloud the room, it froze it. A thick, rolling fog of sub-zero vapor expanded aggressively, swallowing the linoleum floor, the triage desks, and the scattering bodies of the terrified medical team. Visibility dropped to less than 3 feet in a heartbeat. "Seal the exits!" Kane roared. His voice was a jagged tear in the white noise. The mercenary was hurt. The heavy steel cylinder had clipped his shin bone on its way across the room, but pain was a language he had stopped speaking years ago. He limped forward, his silhouette looming in the mist like a spectre. He raised his suppressed pistol, sweeping the barrel in a tight, professional arc. "She's in the fog," Kane barked into his comms, his eyes scanning the swirling vapor for movement. "Check your fire, but if you see a shadow that moves, you put it down. I want her bleeding." Detective Miller, his lungs burning from the sudden intake of cold, dry gas, scrambled on his hands and knees. He grabbed Brenda by the back of her scrub top and hauled her behind the solid oak curve of the central nurses' station. "Stay down," Miller rasped, coughing into his sleeve. "Keep your head below the wood." Brenda was hyperventilating, her eyes wide and fixed on the white oblivion beyond the desk. "Who are they?" she whimpered. "Miller, they have guns." Miller checked his service revolver. 4 rounds, against 2 private military contractors wearing ballistic vests and carrying high-caliber semi-automatics. He felt a cold pit of dread open in his stomach. "These aren't feds." "Brenda," Miller whispered, wiping sweat from his eyes. "Feds don't turn an ER into a kill box. Just stay quiet." But Susanna Reed wasn't staying quiet. She was moving. To Kane and his partner, the fog was a blinding obstacle. To Susanna, it was a blanket. She had spent a year hunting cartel runners in the cloud forests of the Peruvian Andes. She knew how sound distorted in the mist, how shadows could be weaponized. She didn't run for the automatic doors. That was the amateur play. That was what a frightened nurse would do. Instead, she moved deeper into the belly of the beast, gliding silently toward Trauma Bay 1. Her breathing was controlled, rhythmic, syncing with the chaos rather than fighting it. Pulse 110. Adrenaline optimal. Weaponry improvised. She reached the trauma bay. Her eyes scanned the crash cart. She needed tools. In a hospital, everything is designed to save a life. But with a little imagination, almost anything could be used to end one. Kane's partner, a thick-necked operator named Bishop, moved toward the sound of the earlier crash. He was nervous. He swept his weapon left and right, the suppressor on his pistol looking like a black finger, accusing the fog. "I don't see her. Kane!" Bishop shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "The gas is too thick. We're blind in here." "She's a ghost, you idiot. Stop looking with your eyes and start listening. Check the ceiling. Check the vents." Susanna wasn't in the vents. She was 3 feet behind Bishop, crouching in the heavy shadow of a portable X-ray machine. She watched him step past her. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his finger twitched on the trigger. He was wearing a Kevlar vest, standard private security issue. Center mass shots were useless, but his neck was exposed. His joints were vulnerable. Susanna reached onto the metal tray of the crash cart. Her hand closed around the cold steel of a pair of trauma shears, heavy-duty scissors designed to cut through leather and denim. In her other hand, she grabbed a heavy-hung glass IV bottle of mannitol. She calculated the geometry of the takedown. Bishop was 190 pounds. She was 115. Strength wasn't the answer. Physics was. Distraction first. She commanded herself. She rolled the glass bottle across the floor. It clattered loudly against the metal baseboard of bay, to the sound sharp and distinct through the hissing gas. Bishop spun around, weapon raised. Contact right. He fired 2 shots. Thwip, thwip. The suppressed rounds shattered the drywall where the bottle had hit, puffing white dust into the white fog. It was the opening she needed. Susanna lunged. She didn't scream. She didn't grunt. She moved with the silent lethality of a sudden drop in air pressure. She jammed the blunt, heavy handle of the trauma shears into the soft hollow behind Bishop's knee, the popliteal fossa. It was a precise, crippling strike to the nerve cluster. Bishop's leg didn't just buckle, it collapsed as if the bone had turned to water. He gasped, his balance evaporating. As he fell backward, Susanna was already rotating. She caught his gun hand, twisting the wrist outward with a torque that bypassed the joint's natural range of motion. Snap! Bishop's trigger finger broke. He tried to scream, but Susanna drove her elbow into his solar plexus, forcing the air from his lungs in a breathless wheeze. She spun him around, shoving his wheezing, broken body into a rack of metal surgical trays. The crash was catastrophic, a cacophony of steel hitting tile. "Bishop!" Kane yelled from the other side of the room. He fired blindly into the fog toward the sound. Bullets sparked off the floor, sending ceramic shrapnel flying. "Stop firing!" Miller shouted, his police instinct overriding his survival instinct. He popped up from behind the desk, leveling his revolver. "Chicago PD, drop the weapon." The fog swirled, and Kane materialized like a demon. He turned his gun toward Miller. His face was a mask of cold, professional indifference. He didn't care about the badge. He didn't care about the law. "Collateral damage," Kane sneered. He tightened his grip on the pistol. He began to squeeze the trigger. Miller flinched, his eyes squeezing shut, expecting the punch of the bullet. Thwack! The gunshot never came. Instead, a wet, meaty sound echoed through the room. Kane roared, his gun clattering to the floor. He stumbled back, clutching his right forearm. Embedded deep in the muscle of his flexor tendon was a silver scalpel. It had been thrown with such velocity and precision that it had severed the nerve connection to his fingers. Kane looked down at the handle sticking out of his arm, his brain struggling to process the impossibility of the shot. He looked up, his eyes wild, scanning the shifting white haze. "Come out." "Susanna!" He bellowed, ripping the scalpel free with a spray of dark blood. He tossed it aside. "Stop playing games. You know you can't leave. The director will burn this whole city to find you." The fog parted. Susanna stepped out of the mist near the trauma bay. She looked different. The terrified, mousy nurse was gone. She had ripped the sleeves off her scrub top to free her range of motion. Her glasses were gone, revealing eyes that were cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of mercy. Her hair had come loose from its bun, framing a face that looked like it was carved from granite. In her hands, she held the paddles of a defibrillator. The machine sat on a cart behind her, humming with a high-pitched, rising whine that set teeth on edge. "Whoa!" "Clear," Susanna said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a judge passing sentence. Kane laughed. It was a wet, jagged sound. He reached into his boot and pulled out a backup weapon, a serrated combat knife with a 6-inch blade. "You think paddles are going to stop me?" Kane scoffed, shifting his weight to his good leg. "I'm going to carve you up. Nightingale, I'm going to take you apart, piece by piece, until you tell me where the files are," he charged. Kane was fast. Despite his injury, he moved with the explosive power of a man who killed for a living. He slashed the air in a figure-8 pattern, a defensive web of steel designed to keep an opponent at bay while he closed the distance. Susanna didn't retreat. She stepped in. She dodged the first slash by millimeters, the wind of the blade cooling her cheek. She stepped back, parrying his wrist with the hard plastic casing of the left paddle. She wasn't trying to hit him yet. She was guiding him. She was leading him into the wet zone. The earlier explosion, or perhaps the sheer heat of the violence, had triggered a malfunction in the fire suppression system's sensors. The sprinklers above them hadn't fully engaged, but they were leaking, dripping water onto the floor in a steady, pooling rhythm. Kane lunged for a killing thrust, aiming for her stomach. Susanna sidestepped. It was a movement of pure grace, a matador avoiding the bull. Kane's momentum carried him forward, his heavy leather shoes splashing into the puddle of water. "Ground," Susanna whispered. She dropped the left paddle into the water at Kane's feet. Kane's eyes widened as he realized the trap. But momentum is a cruel mistress. He couldn't stop. Susanna jammed the right paddle into the metal IV pole standing directly next to him. Zap! The laws of physics took over. The electrical circuit completed itself. The charge didn't need to hit his heart directly. It sought the path of least resistance. It traveled from the machine, through the metal pole, into the water, and surged up through the soles of Kane's wet shoes. 360 joules of pure electricity slammed into his nervous system. Kane went rigid. His muscles seized instantly, locking his skeleton into a grotesque statue of agony. His teeth clamped down so hard that a molar cracked with an audible pop. He stood there, vibrating like a tuning fork, smoke rising from his socks, before his eyes rolled back into his head. He toppled over backward, hitting the floor stiff as a board. Thud! The smell of ozone and burnt rubber filled the air, overpowering the metallic scent of blood. Susanna stood over him, her chest heaving. The defibrillator whined, signaling it was ready to charge again. She hit the power button, silencing it. She knelt and checked Kane's pulse. It was erratic, thready. But there, he would live. He would wake up in a cell or a hospital bed. But he would live to fail his director. The ER fell silent. The oxygen tank had finally emptied itself, leaving only a faint hiss. The fog began to dissipate, revealing the wreckage of the night. Detective Miller slowly stood up from behind the desk. He kept his gun trained on the unconscious Kane, his hands shaking. He looked at the carnage. He looked at Susanna. She was standing amidst the debris, wiping blood from her arm, blood that wasn't hers. The transition was happening again. The cold soldier was receding, and the exhaustion of the woman was crashing in. "Jesus! Reed!" Miller said, his voice trembling. He lowered his gun, realizing how useless it had been. "Who are you?" Susanna looked at him. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a profound sadness in its wake. She looked at the destroyed ER, the place where she had tried to build a normal life. It was gone now, burned to the ground by her past. "I'm just a nurse," she said softly, the lie sounding fragile in the quiet room. Sirens wailed in the distance. Real police, lots of them. SWAT teams, ambulances, the news choppers. They were minutes away. Susanna looked at the exit. The sliding doors were broken, hanging off their tracks. "You can't go," Miller said, taking a step toward her. "You have to give a statement. You're a witness, a victim. We can protect you." Susanna let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Protect me, Miller. Look around you. If I stay, They'll kill everyone in this building just to get to me. They don't care about badges." She walked over to the triage desk. Her movements were urgent now. She grabbed a permanent marker and a piece of sterile gauze. She scribbled a string of numbers on the fabric hastily, but clearly, she shoved the gauze into Miller's hand. "What is this?" Miller asked, staring at the numbers. "A bank account number in the Caymans," Susanna said, her eyes locking onto his. "It belongs to the man who sent them. Director Krell. Don't give it to the local cops. Give it to the International Criminal Court. It has the funding codes for 3 illegal black sites in Eastern Europe." "Susanna, my name isn't Susanna," she said. She turned to Brenda. The older nurse was peeking out from under the desk, clutching a stapler like a weapon. Susanna softened. "Brenda, you were right." "Right about what?" Brenda whispered. "I needed more grit." Brenda managed a watery, terrified smile. Susanna adjusted her scrubs, took one last look at the life she was leaving behind, and turned. She didn't walk. She ran. She sprinted through the ruined ambulance bay doors, disappearing into the cold, rainy Chicago night just as the first squad cars screeched into the parking lot, their blue lights painting the walls in flashes of warning 48 hours later. The official narrative was constructed before the smoke had even cleared from the emergency room. By the time the sun rose over Chicago, St. Jude's Hospital was no longer a crime scene. It was a containment zone. Men in charcoal suits, carrying briefcases instead of badges, descended upon the administration wing. They didn't ask questions. They gave orders. Confiscate the phones. Wipe the hard drives. Sign the non-disclosure agreements, or face federal indictment for Hyper-A violations. The 6 p.m. news ran the approved script, a gang-related incursion involving a high-profile target. The brave, unnamed staff member who intervened was praised for her quick thinking and then promptly erased from the record. As for the video, the shaky footage of the Nurse Hulk that had captivated millions, it vanished. 1 minute it was trending worldwide. The next, it was gone. Links led to 404 errors. Accounts that re-uploaded it were suspended for violating community guidelines on violence. The internet was scrubbed with a digital bleach so potent it left nothing but rumors. But you can't scrub a memory. In the dark corners of the web, on encrypted message boards and hacker collectives, the legend of the Nightingale began to mutate. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a myth, a glitch in the matrix that the powers that be were desperate to hide. Chicago Police Precinct, 12th District. Detective Miller sat in his cramped office, the blinds drawn against the grey morning light. He stared at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He felt old. He felt tired. For the last 2 days, he had been pulled into rooms with mirrors on the walls and interrogated by 3 different agencies whose acronyms he didn't recognize. They had drilled him for hours. What did she say? Where did she go? Who did she contact? He had stuck to the lie, repeating it until it tasted like ash in his mouth. I saw nothing. It was chaos. The nurse panicked and ran. They had let him go, but the threat hung in the air like ozone. Think of your pension, detective. Think of your family. Miller reached into his pocket and pulled out the piece of gauze. It was wrinkled now, stained with a smudge of dirt. But the marker ink was still sharp. It was just a string of numbers, a bank account in the Caymans. He looked at his computer screen. The cursor blinked on the submission form for the International Criminal Court's anonymous tip line. He hesitated. If he typed these numbers, He was declaring war on men who could make a police detective disappear without a ripple. He could just burn the gauze. He could go home, drink a beer, and watch the game. He could forget Susanna Reid ever existed. But then he remembered her eyes in the ER. He remembered the bruises on her arms and the terrified determination in her voice when she said, "My name isn't Susanna." She had saved them all. She had saved Brenda. She had even saved the man she electrocuted. "Oh, to hell with it," Miller muttered. His fingers flew across the keyboard. He entered the account number, he entered the routing codes, and in the comment box, he typed a single sentence, "Funding source for unauthorized black sites, Director Krell." He hit send. The screen flashed, "Submission received." Miller sat back. Exhaling a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 48 hours. He didn't know if it would work. He didn't know if the ICC was corrupt too, but the weight in his pocket was gone. "Good luck, kid," he whispered to the empty room. Somewhere in the Swiss Alps. The chalet was a fortress of glass and timber, perched on a cliff edge where the air was thin and the silence was absolute. This was where Director Krell came to think, to plan, and to escape the noise of the world he manipulated. Krell sat by a roaring fireplace, a tumbler of 50-year-old scotch resting on his knee. The firelight danced on the walls, but it did nothing to warm the chill that had settled in his bones since the report came in from Chicago. Team 4 had failed. Kane was in critical condition. Bishop would never walk without a cane again. And the asset Nightingale was in the wind. His personal phone buzzed on the side table. Krell frowned. That phone was a ghost device. The number was encrypted with military-grade rolling codes. Only 3 people on Earth had it, and 2 of them were dead. He picked it up. A text message. "Unknown sender." His heart gave a strange, singular thump against his ribs. He opened the message. It was a photograph. Krell squinted. The image was dark, grainy, taken in low light. It showed a living room. His living room. There was the fireplace. There was the armchair. And there, in the center of the frame, was the back of a man's head, Krell's head. The photo had been taken from outside, through the floor-to-ceiling glass window behind him. Krell stopped breathing. The glass shattered in his hand, whiskey and shards raining onto the expensive rug. He scrambled out of the chair, knocking it over, and backed away toward the wall. He looked at the phone again. Beneath the photo, a single caption glowed on the screen. "The patient is awake, and she's coming for the doctor." Krell spun around and stared out into the blinding white darkness of the snowstorm. He saw nothing but the swirling flakes and the oppressive black of the pine forest. But he knew she was there. Or she had been. Seconds ago. He wasn't the hunter anymore. The roles had flipped. The bird he had caged was now a raptor. And for the first time in 20 years, the director felt the icy grip of fear. Chicago. 1 month later. The physical scars on Street. Jude's hospital had healed faster than the psychological ones. The hole in the wall was patched and painted a sterile beige. The shattered glass of the entrance had been replaced with reinforced panes. The scorch marks on the floor where Kane had been electrocuted were scrubbed away, covered by wax and the squeak of rubber shoes. But the air was different. The staff moved with a hyper-awareness they hadn't possessed before. They checked exits. They watched the doors. It was 2:00 a.m., the witching hour. Brenda sat at the central station, organizing charts. She looked tired, but the softness was gone from her face. Her eyes were sharp. The automatic doors slid open. A woman walked in, tall, red-haired, moving with a confident, athletic stride. She wore navy blue scrubs that fit perfectly. "Hi," the woman said, leaning on the counter. "I'm the new transfer. Name's Emily. Agency sent me." Brenda looked her up and down, scrutinizing her hands, her stance, her eyes. "You got any experience with psychiatric hold patients?" "A little," Emily said, flashing a professional smile. "I worked at County for 3 years." Brenda held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Good," she grunted, sliding a clipboard across the desk. "Because the last girl we had, let's just say she set the bar pretty high." Emily frowned, sensing the weight behind the words. "High? How so?" "She didn't just do the job," Brenda said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "She saved the soul of this place. In the back of the waiting room, sitting in a wheelchair awaiting discharge for his surgically reconstructed knee, was Jerome the Titan. He was different now. The madness had been drained out of him, replaced by a heavy, contemplative silence. He was clean. The drugs were out of his system. He wore a plain T-shirt that stretched tight over his massive chest, but his posture was slumped, non-threatening. He stared at the spot near the trauma bay where the fight had happened. He replayed it in his mind every night, the pain of his arm breaking, the humiliation of hitting the floor. But mostly, he remembered the moment before he passed out. She had him dead to rights. She could have snapped his neck. Instead, she had leaned in. "You're better than this, big man. Wake up." It was the first time in 10 years anyone had spoken to him like a human being, not a monster. Jerome looked at the new nurse, Emily. He saw her confidence, her training, but she wasn't her. He touched his own neck, where the vagus nerve strike had landed. A phantom ache. "She ain't gone," Jerome rumbled, his deep voice carrying through the quiet waiting room. Brenda looked up. What was that? "Jerome." Jerome smiled, a small, sad, genuine thing. He looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, where the city lights bled into the darkness. "The little bird," Jerome said. "She ain't gone. She's just on break, waiting for the next shift." Outside, the wind howled through the streets, rattling the street lamps. It carried the sound of sirens, the heartbeat of a city that was always bleeding, always breaking. And somewhere out there, in the shadows between the buildings, where the surveillance cameras didn't reach, the nightingale was watching, waiting, ready to clock in. And that is the legend of Susanna Reid, the nurse who turned an ER into a war zone and walked away without a scratch. But the story doesn't really end there, does it? The director is still out there, and the nightingale is hunting. What do you think was Susanna right to run? Or should she have stayed and fought the system from the inside? And more importantly, could you keep a secret like that for 3 years? If you want to hear the next chapter, where Susanna takes the fight to Creel's doorstep, hit that like button right now. Let's get this video to 10,000 likes, and I'll drop part 2. The hunter becomes the hunted. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next crazy true crime saga. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.